Welcome to Nature Revisited, the podcast. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Noorden, and thank you, everyone, for joining me. On this episode, I am joined by Zoë Schlanger to talk about her new book, The Light Eaters. Zoë Schlanger is an award-winning staff writer at The Atlantic magazine. She is a winner of the National Association of Science Writers and a finalist for the Livingston Award. In The Light Eaters, Zoë takes us around the globe, digging into the soil with scientists who have spent their lives studying the incredible world of plants. Zoë joins me from her home in Brooklyn to talk about the ongoing discoveries and debates that surrounds the question, what is a plant and who are the light eaters? So Zoë, thank you for joining me on Nature Revisited.
Great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I really enjoyed your book, The Light Eaters, and I have been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. So let's start with what inspired you to quit your job and to think about plants full-time. Why did you want to know what a plant is?
To give you a little background on me, I am a climate reporter. I'm currently at The Atlantic magazine. At the time that I started thinking about plants, I was at a different newsroom, and I had been covering climate change for about 7 years. And I was starting to get pretty depressed, as anyone who pays attention to climate news can probably imagine. I started to feel not connected to the real stakes of climate change. It scared me to be numb to these very real, painful changes the world is going through. I spoke to my editor and he said, why don't you just take a break and cover something that makes you feel the opposite of that? I have been interested in plants my whole life. I hadn't had a formal background in botany, but I had been interested in them. So I turned to botany papers, botany journals. Journalists have access to scientific reports before they come out. And it very quickly became apparent that I had fallen into the world of botany at an incredibly pivotal time for plant science. There were debates going on in the pages of these journals that were unbelievable to me. There were scientists, very sober scientists, very careful scientists, debating whether or not plants were intelligent, whether or not plants were potentially conscious, whether you could call something intelligent if it didn't have a brain. Anytime you see this kind of controversy in these arcane, very niche journals, you know that the debate is really based on something that could no longer be ignored. There had been this debate in the 70s about plant intelligence, but it had largely gone underground. And now it was resurrecting itself with a lot better support because of technological advances. I realized I had come across a really good story. You do get a sort of tingly feeling as a journalist when you recognize that there's some incredible story in front of you. And I realized I wanted to do this all the time. I had gone out to meet some botanists in Hawaii. Being out in the field with botanists made me realize I wanted to talk to botanists all the time. They are some of the most spectacularly interesting, endearing people because they're studying something most of the world thinks very little about. They've put their entire lives into it. They are enamored with plants and treat them like the wondrous organisms they are in a way that I wanted to see more of, to be around more of that. So it was a few different things. It was a pretty selfish choice for my own brain health, but it was also that the story was too good to not turn to that full time.
So one of the things I learned from all your conversations with so many people who are studying the way plants live and survive is that so much comes down to interpretation and language. how difficult was it for you to maneuver through so many conflicting ideas?
When I say that there was this fight happening in botany, that there was anti-plant intelligence people and pro-plant intelligence people, that was a niche subset of the wider plant science community. Most scientists are just doing their work and putting their head down. Almost universally, the language that was being used in scientific papers coming out that researching questions that relate to plant intelligence, most often these papers would investigate a behavior without saying words like intelligence at all. Their results were still implying something, to my eyes, that looked like plant intelligence. So when I would call some of these plant scientists, I would have to be careful at first to explain to them that I was doing a rigorous reporting project. This wasn't looking for sensational one-off things about how plants are little people. I had to sort of prove to them that I was in this for the nuance, for the contradictions, and to treat their science with the respect it deserved. So it does require a little bit of a dance when you're calling a scientist. They don't want to have their work misinterpreted. The stakes for them are very high. Science is a conservative institution for a reason. I respect the way that scientists are very careful about how they use words because they know that they are the basis, they're the first stop for all knowledge. Knowledge gets formed on the back of what they're finding, their little piece of the world that they're finding out about. And they want to make sure that that base does not have a crack in it. The other thing I really found is that in reading these papers, I had to encounter a ton of passive language. You would not believe how good scientists are at avoiding using extremely active language to talk about plants. So the other thing I would say about language is, what does it matter almost at the end of the day what language we use for plants? That was something else I had to come to terms with. We don't have a definition of consciousness even for ourselves. No one knows the mechanical basis for our own consciousness. And for plant scientists who are all after mechanical bases of phenomena, that's a frustrating thing.
So you talk about in your book, The Secret Life of Plants. Can you talk about how that book impacted both the general public and the science world?
Absolutely. Secret Life of Plants came out in 1972, I believe. It was an immediate success in the popular market. And that's not something that had ever happened for a botany book before. It was a very big deal. The culture was sort of ripe for it. It delved into the outer edges of botany research. But at the time, some of that research was investigating things that were hard to prove. The authors also included a lot of science that can best be described as citizen science. It wasn't exactly hardcore lab science. Things like a former CIA agent named Cleve Baxter, who strapped a lie detector to his houseplant, lighting his houseplant on fire. And in his telling of it, his lie detector test went wild, implying that the plant was reading his mind, that it could detect this malevolence in his thoughts and was responding to it. Things like that in this book really struck a chord with people. They really stuck in the popular imagination. A lot of the book was discredited from a science perspective. When something like that happens, already very conservative institutions of science freeze up. They get nervous. And what happened was that plant science that dealt in this area of behavior and intelligence in plants, there was such a sense that this thing had gotten out of hand, that it was dangerous to keep pursuing this work, and then to have the embarrassment of having it put into a book full of half-truths, some good science and some bunk science, and then have the field misinterpreted by the public. Say the word Secret Life of Plants to any botanist, and they will immediately sort of cringe and wince because it just left an indelible mark on the field that made it harder to get grants. This book is also the reason that people talk to their houseplants. It was an idea first introduced in the book that plants like when you talk to them. It also had things in it about how plants prefer Beethoven to rock and roll. That's where the idea that playing classical music for your plants, that's a good thing. But I find it so interesting because on the one hand, it drove this world of plant intelligence research underground and defunded it and stalled progress on it for probably 30 years. On the other hand, there are elements that were in that book that were mostly discredited or poo-pooed at the time that current research is validating to some extent. There's a chapter, for example, about plants hearing things, that they could be affected by tone. And there was a suggestion that instead of crop dusters, one day we would be putting boom boxes in farm fields. That's actually research that's going ahead right now. There's actually a lot of research happening, especially in China, around how playing tones for crop plants can boost their immune system and help them ward off pests on their own. So it hasn't been completely validated, but there are glimmers that suggest our technology now is able to answer some of these questions that that book couldn't get all the way to.
Studies of plants touches on so many different aspects of what plants might be capable of, such as intelligence, consciousness, memory, and communication. Just how complex are plants, and what is plant blindness?
Plant blindness is this thing that causes a lot of anxiety among plant scientists. Plant blindness is the general inability for the public to seem to see plants as living organisms. We see plants more like the decoration of our lives, not so much like living dynamic creatures that they are. The average person can distinguish between probably like 20 different breeds of dog, but doesn't know the difference between a birch tree and a beech tree, for example, or doesn't know how to distinguish between rye plants or wheat plants. We're all guilty of this to some extent, but it results in real impacts. It means that a science-basic plant research is harder to fund than research on animals. It means that conservation is also a harder battle to fight. There's a lot of charismatic megafauna, but you don't know about charismatic flora. We have a few things that we like as humans, a few crops that make it into our consciousness as important to us, like coffee or corn or bananas. For rare plant botanists, plant blindness means that getting their species attention is just an uphill battle. A man named Steve Perlman, who spent the last 40-something years rappelling off cliffs on far-flung Pacific islands to hand-pollinate individual plants where there's only maybe 5 of their species left in the wild. He has to piggyback off other people's science budgets to get into helicopters to reach these places because no one cares about these plants where there's only 5 individuals left. So plant blindness factors into these people's lives on a regular basis. And I think it's something that we're culturally perhaps changing now. I feel like there is more recognition of plants as living organisms. You asked how complex plants are. That is a huge question. I feel like to think about plants, you have to imagine an organism that's capable of more sensing than we are. They have entire realms of senses, like, for example, incredibly specific chemical detection. Plants are basically organisms covered in pores and open and close and take in gases and let out gases. And plants are sort of tasting the air around them at all times to decide many of their life functions, including to communicate, to receive signals from other plants about what's happening in their environment, or whether they should up their defenses because there's something that's attacking nearby plants. They can also synthesize these chemicals in their bodies as well. So just imagine having this incredible on-demand chemical synthesis factory in your own body. So plants are complex in ways that we're only just beginning to understand now. And every time I talk to a plant researcher, they are so clearly humbled by how much is still unknown about plants, how many mysteries still abide. Even the way that a plant senses gravity is still a mystery. We don't understand so many things about them because we expect there to need to be a brain to do a lot of these things. But there is no brain.
In your book, you talk about plant memory. Why is that so important?
When you think about plants, they live in one place. They're rooted in place their entire lives. But they're incredibly dynamic and moving constantly through growth. And they're making decisions based on their environment about where to grow. And so when I look at a plant now, I'm seeing roots and shoots. Each one of those things are a plant decision through space at a different point in time. to do something in response to their environment. So in some ways, the entire memory of that plant's existence is decodable on site. They are a physical representation of their choices. The fact that plants keep track in their bodies of time and temperature. I've just been thinking a lot about fruit trees lately because in the Northeast last year, we lost a lot of the stone fruit crop because of a late spring freeze. The thing about fruit trees is that they need the memory of winter in order to bloom in the spring. So it isn't just a matter of the spring coming eventually. They actually have to have a certain duration of cold days. They somehow count. No one knows how they do this, but they count days of cold and then days of warm to know when to emerge. There's a sort of active thing happening even when they're in the most deep part of their dormancy. That process is called vernalization, and it's colloquially called the memory of winter, which I think is quite poetic. Other plants count in other ways. Venus flytraps, for example, they have these little hairs inside of their mouth-like leaves, those the traps that you see in a Venus flytrap. Those hairs need to be triggered a certain number of times in a certain amount of time for the trap to close. And that's how the plant makes sure it's not closing on something like a leaf. A hair gets triggered once, the trap won't close because it's not sure that it's a living thing that's inside of it. It's not worth starting the process of digestion for. Let's say 3 hairs get triggered within a few minutes, then they have a pretty good idea that there's a fly wriggling around in there. And that if they close on that fly, they will get a meal. Kind of complex math happening here, all of which requires memory, all of which requires some kind of timekeeping sense, revising happening for this plant all of the time that we can only describe as short-term memory. And the stakes are very high. You have to have this kind of memory.
You mentioned earlier gravity and the important part that it plays in plant consciousness and intelligence. How does Gilroy and Toyota fit in?
I'm so glad you're asking about those two. Visiting Simon Gilroy's lab was one of my favorite parts of reporting this book. He runs a lab in Wisconsin where he studies plant touch. He was originally trying to study plant gravity detection, which I'll talk about in a minute, but ultimately he ended up studying how plants perceive touch. Actually discovered that you could put fluorescent green proteins from jellyfish into a plant and bind them to a calcium receptor. It gets a little bit complicated, but the point is, using this fluorescence from a jellyfish, you could visualize in a plant the process of that plant sending electrical signals through its body. So think of the way our nerves function. If you touch your face with your finger, there are nerves in the face and the finger, and they're each taking note of that touch and sending the physical marker for that touch to your brain, and you're experiencing it as touch. Plants seem to have pretty similar systems for detecting touch. We don't often think of this when we're touching a plant. I touch my houseplants all the time. When I went to this lab in Wisconsin, I got to actually pinch one of these plants that had this green fluorescent protein in its body. They handed me these tweezers. I felt like I was in one of those experiments where you're told to press a button, but they said, pinch really hard. So I pinched this leaf quite hard with these tweezers. And under the microscope, you could see this green fluorescence traveling from the place where I pinched the plant with the tweezers down the main vein of this leaf that I pinched, and then slowly over the whole plant body until the whole plant had received an electrical signal of that touch. This is absolutely cutting edge stuff. The idea that plants feel touch at all is quite radical a notion for a field that had sort of assumed there wasn't this whole scale, whole body signaling pathway for the plant. But it does explain a lot of things. It explains why damaging one part of a plant will spark the immune system of a far-flung part of that plant. How a plant gets a message from one part of its body that there are caterpillars chewing on it to the rest of its body so it can adequately respond. It's quite a magical thing to actually touch a plant and watch it respond in real time. They got to this research by thinking about the question of gravity. We know in our cells how we sense gravity. We have these hair-like structures in our inner ears. But in plants, we've also found these little hairs, but there's no brain to send that signal to. Whereas in our body, the depression of those hairs sends a signal to our brain. There's no brain for the plant. No one understands how there could be this whole system signaling of which way is up without that brain. Something so basic as gravity is still inexplicable to us when it comes to plants, that we've been living with these creatures for so long, and we still have absolutely no idea how they do the most basic of things. So this is an abiding mystery that Gilroy and Toyota were trying to figure out when they stumbled upon the touch sensing visualization.
Shifting it a little bit, can you talk about the importance of the spiritual and the philosophical when it comes to the study of plants?
I find that science is not the best place to look for something like ethics. There was a time when science and naturalism studies was a philosophical endeavor. People were both men of science and men of philosophy. In the last 100 years or more, science has become increasingly specialized and increasingly good at answering the questions it knows how to ask. Less good at considering ethical implications, considering moral implications. These are things that have been relegated to the philosophical realm and considered quite unscientific. And I understand why. But when it comes to something like whether or not plants are intelligent or conscious, or what we owe them if they are these things, if we are understanding plants as far more living and aware than we've ever understood them before, science doesn't have a lot of answers for what to do with that information when it comes to society. That's where the philosophical really comes in. And there's a wonderful realm of philosophy that does deal with this. There's been quite a philosophical turn towards plants in philosophical thought and theory. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the animal rights movement, which is also a more spiritual and philosophical project than a scientific one. Of course, the science came to support it in all of the ways that science is understanding animals is much more sensitive and dynamic than we thought. Animals play, that animals have complex language. All of these things we're learning about them, that's thanks to science. But what we do with that information is thanks to philosophy and ethics. So I do find a lot of hope for people who are trying to marry the two. I do think we need it at this moment. We can't be learning all this about plants without having some ethical recourse, some debates happening about what it means for our behavior as society towards them.
How have you come to define communication after doing all the research you have done for the book?
I'm glad you're asking that. Communication is another one of these slippery things where no one has a specific definition for it. People use many different ones. I like to use a broad as possible definition that doesn't have to get us too muddy in the waters of intention. Communication is when a signal is sent and then is received and causes an effect in the receiver. So it's much more about the organism receiving the information, finding it useful, and doing something with it. And I think that works beautifully with plants because you can't ask a plant if it intended to send out that chemical, but it certainly sends out chemicals. And what we can see is the effect it produces in the plant that receives that information. If a willow tree in Washington is being decimated by a tent caterpillar invasion, and it emits a certain airborne chemical, and that chemical, when picked up by a tree farther away that hasn't yet encountered these caterpillar pests, if that tree then boosts its immune system and makes its leaves very bitter tasting or poisonous or not nutritious to the caterpillars, we know that communication is taking place because a signal was sent and received and caused a change in the receiver. I think it's impossible not to call that communication, even if we can't ask the sender tree why it did that.
So you say in the book, all biology is ecology. Can you elaborate?
Sure. This was one of the biggest conclusions I came to in doing this research. Very humbling conclusion. I set out trying to write a book about just plants. And I very quickly realized that that's an impossible task because plants are so completely mingled in with their environment. The boundary between plants and the world that they live in, the environment they live in, is very thin. They're very porous creatures in that way. They're constantly sensing their environment and responding in kind. They're even shaping their environment in certain ways. So the environment is working on them, and they're working on themselves in response. There's all of these component aspects to the plant. It becomes impossible to sort of isolate what an individual plant really is. I think a lot about this philosopher named Emanuele Coccia, an Italian philosopher who writes about plants, and he talks about plants as being in a state of compenetration, which means a sort of complete mutual interfusion between plant and environment and neighboring organisms, where to act and to be acted upon are functionally indistinguishable. You can't separate any of these actors. And that's an ecosystem at the heart of it.
You also talk about the idea that plants have agency. What is agency, and why does it matter?
Agency is a brilliant word for talking about an organism that has capacity for action and to act on its own behalf without having to get into the complicated notions of personhood and selfhood and personality. All of these very human-laden terms can be avoided by using the word agency. It's a word that cuts across people's different tastes. I've heard careful scientists say that they are okay with thinking about biological agency. They're not talking about what they would call maybe the touchy-feely agency of humans, but rather this agency of biological response, where they are experiencing their environment, they are reshaping themselves to respond to it. That is agency. And it also allows for a conclusion about what is happening with plants, what they are, who they are, without needing to understand mechanics. We can watch a plant act as an agent without understanding how it's possible for it to be doing that. Agency really says that to be a plant and to live in the world is not a passive thing. It's a very active thing. The plant is making choices to make their own lives work in whatever environment they find themselves in. That's agency at the heart of it. It's very much a biological function that scientists can be comfortable talking about without feeling like they're acting as philosophers. And yet it has this poetry of intention and capability and activity that totally throws off this idea that plants are passive. No, absolutely the opposite. They are agentive, they're active, they are causing their own changes and then making their own lives work.
How has the quest to answer the question, what is a plant? How has that changed you?
In so many ways. I live very near a park in Brooklyn. I walk through this park most days. And now when I'm in there, I can't help but understand that there is so much happening for each plant around me. It has eradicated much of my plant blindness. I still can't name all of the plants that I see, but I can recognize them as individuals, that there's this constant sense of sensing happening all around me. And that's a really enchanting way to live. I love it. I love how it's changed my perception of the green life that's around all of us. And I love to talk about it as much as possible because I see that flicker of change happen in all my friends when I start pointing things out. It really has humbled me. I much better understand the way that our lives depend entirely on plants. All of our oxygen comes from plants. Every single molecule of sugar we've ever ingested comes from plants. Plants are the only thing that can turn inorganic material into sugar from the sun and water. And without that, we wouldn't exist. This process of writing this book has made that very real and tangible to me.
So after all the work that you have put into writing, is there one plant that you have come to respect more than others?
I don't think there's one I respect more than others. I do, however, feel very partial towards vines. I love watching vines. Vines are the most animal of the plants, I would say, because they amble over their landscape. You can watch them solve problems. You can watch them twine around something and hoist themselves up. Vines are able to do very creaturely things. There's many different ways that they climb. And one of them, for example, is a vine can twine itself around an unstable structure in order to hold it in place while another part of its body sort of traverses it. I love watching vines. They're so funny. They were also a huge preoccupation of Darwin. He wrote a whole book about how vines climb and the choices they made. And thinking of Darwin doing this is amazing because, of course, he didn't have time-lapse photography. He's sitting there watching and making marks for hours to determine the trajectory of these very slow things. He describes vines that will try several times over the same obstacle, and then eventually, as though they were a frustrated person, will throw that option off and try a different route, but only once they get to that point of frustration.
One of the things that I thought about while reading your book is that maybe it is not our inability to find the answers that we seek, but rather that the plant's ability to hide them from us. What do you think about that?
That's an interesting one. It's a bit of a chicken or the egg. Who's hiding from who, or who can see who? I like thinking about that. I do wonder. I'm not sure if they're hiding from us. We just haven't maybe bothered to look. They're just living their lives. Although some plants are very sly, they are very able to manipulate other creatures to do their will. Certain flowers, like orchids, that will manipulate wasps into thinking that they're female wasps, so the wasps want to have sex with them, and that's how they get themselves pollinated. Monkey flowers that lie to gall-forming flies by emitting a certain chemical that says, oh, a fly has already been here, so you don't want to come here. So who knows? Would it be beyond them to be hiding? Probably not. Not if there's some biological utility to doing that. Maybe they are. But more than that, I think there's just a lot we haven't bothered to look at yet.
What do you hope your readers will take away from your book? And what are some of the more important lessons you think we need to learn from plants?
I love that question. I think that there's a certain humility that we are not good at in our culture. Imagining humans as a dominant species or as the end result of evolution is something we need to get rid of. It's an erroneous notion. Evolution doesn't have an end. Evolution is constant, chaotic, forming, reforming randomness that produces such an incredible profusion of life that we are just one thing within. Getting rid of this notion of humans as the ultimate intelligent species gives room for us to ask questions about other species that we could learn a lot from. So the first lesson is just humility and having a sense of awe at the incredible profusion of biology and what it's made. And from there, an expansiveness to our moral systems to start to include all life into our ethical consideration. That would be a really interesting trajectory for humanity at this point. What would it look like if we acknowledge that even something that we have to eat in order to survive should deserve some ethical consideration? What would respecting plants, despite having to eat them, look like? Expanding our minds to hold that complexity and those contradictions would do us really well as a species.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Zoë Schlanger and that you take the time to read her incredible book, The Light Eaters. It will change the way you look at plants. If you enjoyed this episode, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. If you would like to share your thoughts or comments on this or any other episode, please email me at nordenpro@gmail.com. That's Norden, NOORDENPRO @gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and our website, nordenproductions.com. The music for Nature Revisited is Tim Buckley, Buzz and Fly. Nature Revisited is produced by Stefan Van Orden and Charles Gagan. And I hope you will join us for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.